Well, there are new questions about the immediate future for our men and women in uniform today as the Pentagon starts to threaten, quote, pay cuts and deployments on hold in the face of some automatic cuts to the defense budget. Pete Hegseth is the CEO of Concerned Veterans for America. He joins us now on the question of whether our troops are going to pay a price for Washington's failure to make tough decisions. Hi, Pete.
Hi, how you doing, Allison? Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So, as you know, outgoing Defense Secretary Leon Panetta is suggesting a just 1% pay raise for our men and women in uniform. That won't keep up with the cost of living, what they'll have to pay going ahead next year. What do you think that would do for military families?
Well, it is a de facto pay cut. And I think these military families are looking over at the other side. It was also recently announced the civilian workforce. There are unfreezing pay freezes that have happened for non-merit paid government positions outside of the military. So salaries go up outside the military and their salaries going down. You know what they see? You know what I see? We see one gigantic political cop-out. That's what the sequestration debate has turned into. The president refuses to lead. No one will talk details about how to address our debt crisis and the deficit and debt crisis we face. Everyone's entrenched in their positions, so they're sitting back and saying, well, I think sequestration is going to happen. And you know who's going to take the brunt of it? Military families with pay cuts. The across-the-board nature of the cuts are going to hurt our ability to train, our ability to maintain, vehicles and ships and airplanes, and all the things that provide the readiness for our military are going to take a dramatic cut, and we'll have done nothing to actually reform the way we spend money and put our country on a sound fiscal track.
And of course, Pete, as we talk about cutting back, our enemies are ramping up. We've seen North Korea doing more testing. We've seen Iran possibly moving closer to nuclear weapons. Do our enemies overseas pay attention to our budget woes and our plans here at home?
Sure they do. They look at our capabilities. They look at our disposition. They perceive us differently when we're perceived to be drawing back, pulling away from the world, cutting our capabilities. So what happens in Washington is watched very, very closely. And that's why we have to demonstrate our commitment to maintaining the strongest military in the world, and we're just not seen as serious in doing so right now. Sequestration is not a serious proposal. It was meant to be a poison pill so bad that they'd have to compromise to avoid it. Instead, they're unwilling to address our debt crisis by looking at how do you reform the Pentagon? Hey, there are ways to cut the waste and spending in the Pentagon.
Are there?
I would acknowledge
let's
that our organization.
Let's talk about that, because should the military be immune from defense cuts? It sounds like you're saying no, they should not, that we should do some sort of belt tightening. But what would that look like?
We've got to do our part. Hey, let's look at the way we procure our weapon systems. Right now, an idea, the time it takes and the amount of money we overspend in taking an idea battlefield with defense weapon systems is amazing. Years of overrun, billions in cost overruns. You've got to look at maybe certain overseas bases. You can look at our organization released a report that provides a lot of specifics. You've got to audit the Pentagon. The Pentagon's never been audited. Its books are unauditable. There are places, nooks and crannies in the Pentagon budget that we'd better take a look at. But you know why? Because we need to be willing to stand on the moral high ground and say, hey, we're willing to look at our sacred cow. We're willing to look at the Defense Department, what we believe needs to be a strong military defense, so that we can turn to the largest drivers of our debt and deficit in entitlement programs that many on the left are unwilling to touch, that are ultimately the longest and largest drivers of our debt and deficit. If we don't look at the sort of our dirty laundry in the Pentagon, then we can't turn to the real drivers and say it's time for you to reform your programs to make them solvent and get our country on a sound fiscal track. Our debt is a security threat.
Pete, I don't have a lot of time, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the Pentagon should get a mirror and see some of these bigger global issues that they could cut, but leave our men and our servicemen and women alone.
Yeah, it's the difference between reform and indiscriminate cuts, and it's about maintaining capabilities so that America remains the strongest military in the world. It's not about cutting for the sake of cutting. It's reforming to keep it strong so that we can also address our debt crisis that ultimately isn't solved by cutting the Defense Department, but instead reforming other places in our government that are bloated.
Got it. Pete Hegseth, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, meanwhile, there's all